The rain came down like a living thing that night, relentless, cold, and angry. It washed over the quiet Texas town of Rockfield, turning streets into rivers and swallowing every light in darkness. Most people were huddled inside, praying the storm would pass. But Officer Trent, soaked to the bone, kept driving slowly through the flooded road in his patrol car, headlights cutting through the curtain of rain. Then he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound beneath the roar of water. At first he thought it was a cat, but when he stepped out and the beam of his flashlight swept across the pavement, the sound came again, higher, sharper, a baby's cry. His heart dropped. "No way," he muttered, wading through ankle-deep water. The noise came from a storm drain near the intersection. He crouched, knees sinking into the mud, and aimed the light down into the metal grate. For a second he couldn't believe what he saw. A bundle of soaked fabric wedged against the edge of the drain. Something inside it moved. Trent forced the grate open with both hands, his fingers slipping on the cold iron. The wind howled like a warning, but he didn't care. He reached in, pulling the bundle out and tearing the fabric away. A baby's face, blue-lipped, eyes barely open, stared back at him. "Hang on, little one," Trent whispered, pressing the infant against his chest as he sprinted toward the car. He turned the heat all the way up and radioed in for help, his voice breaking. "Dispatch, I've got a baby. Alive. Repeat, a baby alive found in a storm drain." By the time they reached the hospital, the storm had only grown worse. Floodwaters licked at the steps as nurses rushed out to meet him. "He's freezing," one shouted, wrapping the baby in warm towels. The emergency room glowed with white light, and for a moment everything stopped. Just the faint sound of the infant's breathing, shallow but steady. The head nurse, a kind woman named Ruth, leaned over the small bundle. "You poor thing," she whispered. The baby's tiny hand gripped her finger and her eyes filled with tears. He survived the flood, like Elijah in the wilderness. The name stuck. Elias. News spread fast. The next morning, the Rockfield Gazette printed the story on its front page. "Miracle baby found in storm drain." The whole town talked about it, about the baby who should have drowned but didn't. Some said it was fate, others said it was a message from God. Among those who read the paper was a woman named Grace. She sat at her kitchen table, hands trembling as she traced the picture of the newborn in the article. She and her husband, Nathan, had tried for years to have a child. They had prayed, pleaded, and waited, but nothing. Seeing that tiny face wrapped in hospital blankets, something deep inside her broke open. "Nathan," she said, voice trembling, "that's him. That's the sign I've been asking for." Nathan hesitated, looking at her with quiet disbelief. "Grace, you don't even know where he came from." "I don't have to," she whispered. "God does." 3 months later, adoption papers were signed. Grace brought Elias home wrapped in a fresh blue blanket, the same color as the one from that storm. She noticed a birthmark on his shoulder, small and shaped like a cross. Every night she would touch it gently and whisper a verse to him before bed. "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you." Elias would grow up hearing that line more times than he could count. He didn't understand its meaning yet, but something about it always felt familiar. And one day, decades later, that same verse would return, leading him straight to the truth about where he came from. If you were Elias, would you believe his survival was just luck or a sign from something greater? Tell us what you think in the comments below. Elias grew up in a quiet neighborhood where the church bells marked the rhythm of life. On Sundays, he wore a small white shirt and sat beside Grace in the same wooden pew, listening to the pastor's voice echo through the sanctuary. He was a gentle boy, curious, observant, always asking questions that startled adults. One day when he was 6, he looked up at Grace and asked, "Mom, where did I come from?" Grace froze for a moment, then smiled softly. "From God, sweetheart. He sent you to us when we needed you most." It was the truth as she saw it, but Elias felt there was more, something unsaid. He sometimes caught Nathan staring at him with a quiet kind of sadness, as if remembering something he couldn't fix. And at night, when thunder rolled outside, Grace would sit on his bed and whisper the same words over and over. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. Elias would close his eyes, letting her voice drown out the storm. By the time he turned 13, the whispers had turned into questions. At school, his friends joked about who looked like their parents. Same nose, same smile. Elias would laugh with them, but deep down, something twisted inside him. He would stare at his reflection in the mirror, tracing the small cross-shaped mark on his shoulder. Where did you come from? He'd whisper to himself. Grace tried to protect him from the truth for as long as she could, but teenagers have a way of finding what adults hide. One night, Elias found an old newspaper tucked inside a box in the attic. The headline read, "Miracle Baby Found in Storm Drain, Survives Record Flood." There was a photo, a baby wrapped in a towel, a tiny hand clutching the nurse's finger. Elias froze. His heart pounded as he turned the page. The article mentioned no parents, no family, just the officer who found him and the hospital that cared for him. At the bottom, in faded ink, he saw the date. March 2nd, 1989, his birthday. He carried the paper downstairs, his hands trembling. "Mom," he said, voice breaking. "What is this?" Grace looked at the photo, and for the first time in his life, Elias saw fear in her eyes. She took the paper gently, sat down, and began to cry. "I wanted to tell you when you were older," she whispered. "You were found during a storm. A terrible storm. You almost didn't make it. But God brought you to us. You were our miracle, Elias." Elias wanted to be angry, to demand answers, to scream that she'd lied. But seeing her tears stopped him. She had loved him fiercely more than anything. Still, that night he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts spinning. He had always wondered why he felt drawn to water, to the sound of rain, to the shimmer of rivers. Now he knew. The waters had nearly taken him once. As the years went on, that mystery became the quiet undercurrent of his life. He grew into a tall, thoughtful young man, studied theology, and worked as a carpenter beside Nathan. Yet every time he saw his reflection, that mark on his shoulder whispered questions that never went away. When Grace grew ill years later, Elias sat by her bedside, holding her frail hand. She smiled weakly. "You were my answer, Elias," she murmured. "Never forget that." She passed away 2 days later. After the funeral, as rain began to fall lightly on the church roof, Elias found himself standing alone by her grave. The world around him was silent, except for the whisper of water on stone. And for the first time, he realized that the verse she had spoken all his life wasn't just about survival. It was a promise, one he now felt compelled to understand. Elias didn't know it yet, but the search for meaning would soon lead him into the past, to a grave, a name, and a verse that would change everything. The house felt unbearably quiet after Grace's death. Her soft laughter, her hymns in the kitchen, the rustle of her Bible pages, all gone. Only the old clock on the wall remained, ticking through the silence like a heartbeat. Elias spent weeks sorting through her things, unable to let go. One afternoon, he opened the drawer of her bedside table and found a small notebook with verses written in neat handwriting. On the first page was the familiar line, "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you." But beneath it, something new was written, a note in Grace's hand. Isaiah 43:2, the verse that found you. He stared at those words, confused. Found him? The more he thought about it, the more restless he became. He visited the local courthouse, the hospital, anywhere that might have records from 1989. Most files were old, faded, and poorly kept. Some had been damaged in the very flood that almost took his life. But one nurse, now retired, remembered the night vividly. "You were the storm drain, baby," she said softly when he visited her at a nursing home. "We didn't think you'd make it." But a woman came by days later, crying, asking if a newborn had been found that night. We didn't know what to tell her. No one left a name. Elias leaned forward. "Do you remember anything about her?" The nurse shook her head slowly. "Just that she looked broken." She held something in her hand. A small silver cross. That detail haunted him. Who was that woman? And why hadn't anyone told him before? Over the next few months, Elias poured himself into the search. He contacted local archives, news stations, even church registries from nearby towns. One night, while scrolling through an online obituary database, he found something that made his chest tighten. A grave listed under the name Mara Ellison, dated the same year he was found. The short epitaph read, "For the child who crossed the waters, Isaiah 43:2. His heart nearly stopped." The same verse. The listing included the cemetery's location, a small rural town 2 hours away. The next morning, Elias packed a small bag, climbed into his old pickup, and drove through winding back roads until the sign for Willow Creek Cemetery appeared. The air was heavy, still wet from the previous night's rain. Rows of old tombstones stretched across the hill. He walked slowly, scanning each one until he found it. A modest gray headstone with wildflowers growing beside it. The inscription was simple, but the verse below it was unmistakable. Elias knelt, brushing the dirt from the engraved letters. "For the child who crossed the waters," he whispered the rest aloud, "I will be with you." Something inside him shifted, a deep, unexplainable pull. He ran his fingers over the letters again, and that's when he noticed it. A second name carved faintly beneath, Mara Ellison, beloved mother. She was real, he murmured, and she was looking for me. As he stood there, lost in thought, the sound of footsteps echoed behind him. He turned to see a woman in her late 50s carrying a basket of fresh lilies. Her eyes were warm but sad. "You're not from around here," she said kindly. "Are you visiting someone?" Elias hesitated. "I think I might be." He nodded toward the grave. "Do you know who she was?" The woman's expression softened. "Everyone here remembers Mara. She lost her baby in that flood back in '89, never got over it." Elias felt the ground sway beneath him. His heart began to race. "Lost her baby?" The woman nodded slowly. "They said he was swept away before help came." She put that verse on the stone so he'd never be forgotten. Elias swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath. "Isaiah 43:2, he whispered. The woman tilted her head. "How do you know that verse?" He looked down at his shoulder, where the small cross-shaped birthmark peeked through his shirt. "Because," he said quietly, "it's been with me my whole life." The woman's eyes widened as if she'd seen a ghost. "Wait," she whispered. "Come with me. There's something you need to see." The woman led Elias down a narrow path that curved behind the cemetery. The air smelled of rain-soaked grass and wildflowers. She walked in silence, her steps slow and deliberate, as if she was carrying the weight of what she was about to reveal. They stopped before a small wooden cottage surrounded by overgrown vines. "She lived here," the woman said quietly. "Mara Ellison. She was my sister." Elias froze. The words seemed to echo in the damp air. "Your sister?" The woman nodded. "I'm Ruth. We grew up here, both of us. Mara was different after that night. She never left this town again." Ruth opened the door, motioning for him to enter. The house smelled of cedar and old books. Everything was neat, untouched, like someone had carefully preserved the past. On a small table near the window sat a framed photo, a young woman with dark eyes, holding a baby wrapped in a blue blanket. The image was faded, but Elias couldn't look away. "That was taken the day before the flood," Ruth said softly. She named him Daniel. Elias felt his breath catch. "Daniel. She told me she went into labor early," Ruth continued. "The river was rising fast that night. She said she barely made it to the clinic, but something went wrong. The nurse said the baby was stillborn. They never let her see him." Ruth's eyes grew distant. She didn't believe them. She said she heard him cry. But when the flood hit, everything was chaos. The bridge collapsed, the clinic flooded, records were lost. By the time they rebuilt the town, Mara was never the same. Every year, on that date, she'd go to the cemetery and place flowers under that verse. Elias stood frozen, staring at the photo. The resemblance between him and the infant was undeniable. The same chin, the same faint mark on the shoulder visible through the baby's swaddling cloth. He touched his own shoulder instinctively. "Ruth," he whispered. "That mark. The one on his shoulder. Look. He rolled up his sleeve. The small, cross-shaped birthmark glowed faintly under the soft light. Ruth gasped, her hand trembling as she stepped closer. "Oh my God," she whispered. "It's the same." Tears filled her eyes. Mara always said her baby had a tiny cross on his skin. She believed it was a sign from God. She never stopped looking for him, Elias. She never stopped. The sound of rain began to fall softly outside again, as if the sky itself was listening. Elias sank into a chair, overwhelmed. "All this time," he said hoarsely, "she thought I was gone." Ruth nodded slowly. "And you were living just 2 towns away. God works in strange ways." Elias's mind raced. If Mara was my mother, why didn't anyone know? How did I end up in that drain? He tried to piece together the fragments, the missing hours between his birth and that storm. "What happened to her after?" he asked quietly. Ruth's eyes filled with grief. "She passed 10 years ago. Heart failure. But before she died, she told me something I never understood until now." Elias looked up. "What did she say?" "She said, 'If my child is alive, God will send him back to the waters to find me.' I thought it was just her way of holding on to hope. But now," Ruth's voice broke, "now I see she was right." Elias pressed his palms against his face, tears slipping through his fingers. For the first time in his life, the storm that had haunted him didn't feel cruel anymore. It felt sacred, a bridge between what was lost and what was meant to be found. Ruth placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. She wanted him to have this, she said, reaching into a drawer and handing him a small, weathered Bible. She carried it every day. "Look inside the cover." Elias opened it. On the first page, written in delicate handwriting, were the words, "To my son, wherever you are, Isaiah 43:2, you were never lost to me." His vision blurred. The handwriting trembled on the page like a whisper across time. He pressed the Bible to his chest, unable to speak. Ruth's voice was soft. She called him Daniel. "But I think you were always meant to be Elias." Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, not in anger this time, but like a heartbeat of the sky. As Elias stepped out into the rain holding the Bible close, he realized this was only the beginning. There was one more truth he needed, one that would finally connect the life he'd lived with the life he'd lost. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the world washed clean. Mist hung over the cemetery like a quiet veil as Elias stood by Mara's grave once more, the worn Bible pressed against his chest. The air smelled of wet earth and lilies, the same flowers Ruth had laid there yesterday. He knelt in silence, tracing the letters of his mother's name with gentle fingers. Mara Ellison. For the first time, the name felt familiar, like a song he'd known long before hearing it. All his life, Elias had wondered why he'd survived when others might not have, why he'd been pulled from the waters, why he'd been given a second chance. And now, standing here, the answer wasn't in logic. It was in grace. He opened the Bible again, letting his thumb brush against the verse that had followed him since childhood. "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you." It was more than a promise. It was a map, one that had guided both him and the woman who had never stopped believing he was alive. Ruth joined him quietly, her coat wrapped tight against the wind. She would have wanted to see this, she said, to know her boy came home. Elias nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. "I think she already knows." They stood there for a while in silence, 2 lives bound by the memory of one woman's faith. Eventually, Ruth handed him a small envelope. "There's something else she left. She asked me to keep it until I knew it was time." Elias unfolded the envelope carefully. Inside was a photograph, the same one from the cottage, now faded with time. But on the back, written in the same delicate handwriting, were 4 words. "Forgive the storm, son." He closed his eyes. The storm, the one that had taken everything from her, was also the one that had delivered him to safety. It wasn't the enemy. It was the messenger. Later that afternoon, Elias drove back to Rockfield. He stopped by the old church where Grace used to take him every Sunday. The pews were empty, sunlight streaming through colored glass, painting his hands in blue and gold. He sat where they once had, whispering a prayer, not of confusion or desperation, but of gratitude. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice echoing through the chapel. "For both of them." He placed the Bible on the altar, beside a single candle. For a moment, the flicker of flame seemed to dance with the rhythm of his heartbeat. He thought of Grace, the woman who had saved him and given him love when the world had left him with nothing. He thought of Mara, the mother who had carried him into the storm, never knowing he would live. Two women, two acts of faith. Both had carried him through the waters. As he left the church, the clouds parted, and the afternoon sun broke through, washing the streets in golden light. Children's laughter echoed from a nearby park, the sound of life continuing, full and unbroken. Elias smiled, a peace settling deep within him for the first time. Back at home, he hung the old photograph on the wall, Mara holding her baby, her smile faint but radiant. Beneath it, he placed another frame. Grace, sitting on the porch, holding him as a toddler. Side by side, the two women finally shared the same space. He whispered, "I was never alone." As evening fell, Elias sat by the window, the Bible open on his lap. The sound of soft rain began again, gentle this time like a lullaby. He looked out at the horizon and smiled. The storm that had once nearly taken his life had also written his story, and in its echoes he had found not just his past but a conqueror, but his purpose. Sometimes the storms that break us are the very ones that lead us home. Do you believe it was destiny, faith, or pure chance that brought Elias back to his mother's story? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us what this story meant to you.